Lady Isabel Harcourt knew that life was full of setbacks, but she had never imagined that the greatest of them would arise just as she was about to enter the most exquisite tea room in London. A blind date with a wealthy merchant could change the fate of an impoverished lady, her Aunt Matilda had said, repeating the same old refrain for the 10th time before Isabel left home. Now, she stood there, her worn gloves carefully hidden under her muslin skirt, ready to deliver her best performance. The aroma of Earl Grey tea and lemon tarts filled the air, mingling with the murmur of elegant conversations. Isabel offered a silent prayer as her eyes scanned the room. Her future husband, or at least her aunt's latest attempt to secure the family's survival, was supposed to be seated at the table near the window, as described. Taking a deep breath, Isabel tucked a rebellious strand of her brown hair into place and walked with determination toward the solitary figure of a man with impeccable posture. "Mr. Lewis?" she asked with a rehearsed smile. The man looked up from his newspaper, his expression momentarily confused. Then he smiled, not warmly or politely, but with an air of amusement. Isabel hesitated, but interpreted the expression as shyness. "Lady Isabel Harcourt, I presume?" He stood, his voice deep and calm, a tone that seemed at odds with the profile of a nervous merchant. "That's me," she replied, feeling slightly unsettled. Her companion had intense eyes, perfectly groomed brown hair, and an imposing air that was hard to ignore. Aunt Matilda mentioned he was a simple man, but perhaps she underestimated this gentleman. The conversation flowed with surprising ease. Isabel spoke of her passion for books and the letters she wrote to friends living in the countryside. He listened attentively, even with a hint of genuine interest. When she inquired about his work, he paused, an enigmatic glint in his eyes. "Business, mostly," he replied with a simplicity that piqued her curiosity. "What kind of business?" she pressed, attempting to fill the uncomfortable silence. "Importing, exporting, and matters that might bore a lady." His smile returned, but there was something about that answer that didn't quite add up. Isabel dismissed her initial discomfort, reasoning that his shyness might prevent him from sharing more about himself. After all, she was also trying to appear more confident than she truly felt. Later, as they shared a slice of fruitcake, she noticed something peculiar. He seemed to know the names of all the important figures in the room. Isabel found it odd that a supposed merchant would be so familiar with London's elite. "You seem to know a lot of people here," she remarked, raising an eyebrow in suspicion. "London is a big village, milady," he replied with a touch of humor that made her blush, though not before thinking, "There's something he's not telling me." Still, she smiled, because despite everything, his charm was irresistible. When the clock chimed 5, Isabel felt a vibration in her purse. It couldn't be... No. Awkwardly, she pulled out a crumpled piece of paper that her aunt had insisted she bring. A note of reminder, as she had called it. "Mr. Lewis will be wearing a blue wool vest." Isabel froze. The man before her was wearing a gray vest, which was clearly not wool. "My God," she whispered, feeling the ground disappear beneath her feet. "Is something wrong?" He leaned slightly toward her, and she noticed that his amused expression now seemed cautious. You're not Mr. Lewis, are you?" He hesitated, the smile vanishing entirely. "No, milady, I'm afraid I am not." His voice carried an unmistakable sincerity. Isabel stood so abruptly that her purse toppled over, spilling its contents onto the table. Her eyes filled with tears, and her heart grew heavy. This was a complete mistake. I'm sorry." Before he could protest, Isabel turned and rushed out of the tea room. Outside, London's cold air enveloped her, but it couldn't dissipate her humiliation. How could I have been so foolish, she thought. Yet as she walked home, another question kept echoing in her mind. If he wasn't Mr. Lewis, then who was he? Across the city, George Everleigh, Duke of Halford, leaned back in his chair at the tea room, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips. He knew he should have identified himself, but there had been something so genuine about that young woman that he couldn't resist. For the first time in years, he felt more like a person than a title, and for some reason he couldn't stop thinking about her. On the other side of the city, as London's streets filled with shadows in the approaching dusk, Isabel continued her walk home. Who was he? That question hammered in her mind. Everything about him, from the impeccable way he spoke to how he seemed to know every detail of the tea room, stood in stark contrast to what she expected of a merchant. She couldn't explain why, but she felt that this mix-up was only the beginning of something much bigger. "How was the meeting, dear?" Aunt Matilda asked as soon as Isabel stepped into the modest sitting room. "A disaster," Isabel replied, throwing herself onto the sofa and covering her face with her hands. Matilda frowned. "A disaster? Mr. Lewis seemed perfect." "Aunt, he wasn't Mr. Lewis," Isabel burst out, tossing her purse onto the table. "I sat at the wrong table, spoke to a complete stranger, and only realized it when it was too late." "Oh." The older woman clutched her chest, but instead of looking concerned, her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "And who was this stranger?" I don't know," Isabel sighed. "He didn't say." Matilda leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. "Was he wealthy?" "Aunt." Isabel gave her a reproachful look, then hesitated. "Actually, he seemed far more refined than any merchant." Matilda's eyes widened, a conspiratorial smile spreading across her lips. "Then perhaps this disaster isn't so terrible after all." Meanwhile, George, the Duke of Halford, sat in his luxurious library, lost in thought. The tea room already felt like a distant dream, but the memory of Isabel's face, her bright brown eyes, and the way she spoke passionately about her writing remained vivid. Why didn't I tell her the truth? The answer was simple. He was tired. Not of the title exactly, but of what it represented. To most people, George was just the Duke, with a fortune that dazzled and a surname that opened doors. Isabel, on the other hand, hadn't treated him as a position or a prize. She had seen him as a man, even if by mistake. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor before his housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax, entered with a note in hand. "This arrived just now, Your Grace." He took the note and read it quickly. An invitation to a ball at the end of the week. Normally, he would have ignored such an event, but this time he hesitated. Will she be there? By the weekend, the ballroom of Lady Stafford's mansion glimmered with crystal chandeliers and candlelight as couples danced to the strains of violins. Isabel stood in a corner wearing the only elegant dress she had left, hastily altered by her aunt. She knew this ball was yet another of Matilda's attempts to place her in the path of a potential suitor, but her mind was still fixed on the stranger from the tea room. "Smile, dear," Matilda whispered beside her. "Tonight, you might meet your future husband." "My future husband will probably be a baker or a clergyman, Aunt," Isabel replied wryly. She glanced around, trying to escape the conversation, and that was when she saw him. There he was, standing near the fireplace, talking with a group of gentlemen. His brown hair was perfectly combed, and he wore a black suit that exuded elegance. "It's him," she murmured. Matilda followed her gaze and gasped. "You mean that man?" "Yes, Aunt. That's the stranger I met." Matilda clutched Isabel's arm tightly. "Isabel, do you know who he is?" "No." "That is George Everleigh, the Duke of Halford." Isabel felt the ground disappear beneath her. "A duke?" "Yes, the most sought-after man in all of England. Oh, Isabel, you sat at the wrong table but may have found the right man." Isabel needed air. She slipped out to the terrace where the cool night breeze helped calm her thoughts, but not for long. "Milady?" She turned to see George standing there, the moonlight illuminating his face. "Your Grace." Her voice came out cold, an attempt to mask her confusion. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "I should have told you the truth that day." She lifted her chin, challenging him. "Why didn't you?" George hesitated, the words at the tip of his tongue, but all he managed to say was, "Because for the first time, Someone didn't see me as a title. Isabel crossed her arms. And you think that justifies deceiving me? No, he replied sincerely, but I'd like the chance to make amends if you'll allow me. She looked at him, torn between mistrust and the spark of hope flickering inside her. Something in his eyes, honesty, perhaps, made her think that just maybe this wasn't the end of their story. The ballroom of Lady Stafford's mansion was even more dazzling when Isabel returned to the main hall. The candlelight cast golden reflections on the windows, and the music seemed to resonate directly in her chest, a blend of tension and excitement. To trust or not to trust? That was the question pulsing in her mind as George, the Duke of Halford, stood a few steps behind her, watching with a gaze that seemed to pierce her defenses. "Milady, may I have the next dance?" His voice was smooth yet firm, a mixture of invitation and challenge. Isabel hesitated. The murmurs had already begun to ripple through the room. After all, it wasn't every day that the most sought-after duke in England asked a dance of a penniless lady. Yet there was something in George's eyes, a sincerity she hadn't expected from someone like him, that disarmed her. "Very well, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He smiled, a small gesture, but one that made her heart race. As they took their places in the center of the dance floor, the curious gazes of the other guests followed their every move. Isabel tried to ignore the weight of their attention, but it wasn't easy. "I'd like to apologize again," George said as the music began. She raised an eyebrow, keeping her voice low. "Apologies don't erase what happened, Your Grace." "George," he corrected, leaning slightly closer. "At least for this dance, let's forget titles." Isabel couldn't help but smile faintly. "Forget titles? You strike me as a man who has never lived without them." George chuckled softly, a sound surprisingly human for someone so exalted. "Perhaps that's exactly why I appreciated your company. When you didn't know who I was, you were the only person who treated me as a person." Her smile faded, replaced by something more serious. "And now that I know who you are, it changes everything, doesn't it?" George looked at her, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. "No, Isabel. To me, you're still the woman who spoke with passion about the books she loves and who has the courage to challenge me." His words caught her off guard. She looked away, trying to ignore the warmth rising in her cheeks. The Duke was a dangerous man, not because of his power, but because he seemed to see straight into her soul. The dance ended, but he didn't release her hand immediately. Instead, he leaned in slightly and murmured, "Would you allow me to join you on the terrace again?" She hesitated for a second before nodding. Perhaps she thought it was time to uncover who George Everly truly was. On the terrace, the cool night breeze was a welcome relief after the heat and intensity of the ballroom. They walked in silence for a few moments before Isabel stopped and turned to face him. "Tell me, George, why did you really want to speak with me that day?" He took a deep breath, as if carefully choosing his words. "Because you seemed different. Someone who didn't need to pretend or impress." She crossed her arms, her gaze skeptical. "That doesn't sound like something a duke would say." He laughed softly, though there was a touch of melancholy in his voice. "Maybe it's because being a duke isn't always the privilege everyone imagines." Isabel raised an eyebrow. "A man with wealth, power, and land complaining about his life? That's not very convincing." He sighed, his smile fading. "You might not believe it, but sometimes all the power in the world can't buy the freedom to just be yourself." She studied him, trying to decide whether he was being sincere or simply manipulative. Yet something in his voice, in the way he avoided her gaze, told her he was speaking the truth. "So what is it you want, George?" she asked finally. He looked at her, and this time there was no hesitation in his eyes. "I want to get to know you better, Isabel. No lies, no titles, just as a man who feels inexplicably drawn to a woman who sees the world in a way he's never seen." She laughed softly, though there was sadness in her laughter. That sounds like a fairy tale, George. And in the real world, fairy tales rarely have happy endings. Maybe, he said, stepping closer, but maybe they're worth trying for. Isabel felt her heart race, though she couldn't tell if it was from fear or hope. For the first time, she considered that perhaps, just perhaps, the Duke was being genuine. The silence on the terrace felt alive, filled only with the gentle sound of the wind brushing against the marble columns and the distant murmur of the party inside. Isabel watched George cautiously. Every word he spoke seemed deliberate, yet there was something genuine about him that she couldn't ignore. Was she being naive? Or was he truly different from everything she expected of a man in his position? "And what if I told you I can't trust you?" she asked at last, her voice low but firm. George tilted his head, his expression calm. "I'd say you're right to hesitate. My initial approach was dishonest, but my intentions were not." "Your intentions?" She let out a wry laugh. "And what exactly are those, Your Grace? To entertain yourself with the poor lady who made an embarrassing mistake?" He stepped closer, and Isabel instinctively moved back, her shoulder brushing against the terrace's balustrade. "Don't belittle yourself like that, Isabel." His voice was serious now, leaving no room for jest. "What happened was chance. But the way you spoke, with such passion and honesty, was what captivated me." She stared at him, trying to decipher his eyes, but George seemed like a labyrinth of hidden intentions. Still, something in his words rang true, even against her better judgment. "And what exactly do you want from me, George?" she asked, her tone softer now. "Just a chance." He smiled faintly, but his eyes held sincerity. "A chance to prove that, despite the title and all the obstacles, I'm just a man, interested in an extraordinary woman." Her cheeks burned at the unexpected compliment, but before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed on the terrace. Lady Matilda appeared, her skirts swishing and her expression caught between elation and alertness. "Isabel," she called out with a forced smile. "What a coincidence to find you here and, oh, Your Grace." "Lady Matilda." George inclined his head slightly, his composure unshaken by the interruption. "Isabel, dear, Lady Kensington wishes to meet you. It's a wonderful opportunity, you know." Isabel cast George an apologetic look before being quite literally whisked away by her aunt back into the ballroom. Once they were out of George's sight, Matilda gripped Isabel's arm tightly. "My word, girl, what were you doing on the terrace with the Duke of Halford?" "Talking," Isabel replied, exasperated. "Talking?" Matilda gasped, looking nearly scandalized. "Do you realize what's at stake here? He's not some ordinary merchant, Isabel. He's a duke, the most eligible one of all, and you need to be careful with every word, every gesture." "Aunt, please!" Isabel snapped, feeling suffocated. "He's just a man." "Just a man?" Matilda narrowed her eyes as though her niece had uttered the greatest blasphemy. "He's the kind of man who could completely change the fortunes of this family. Think about that." Isabel didn't reply. The truth was, she was thinking about it, but not in the way her aunt imagined. Across the ballroom, George watched as Isabel disappeared into the crowd with her aunt. He knew the rumors were already spreading like wildfire, but for the first time, he didn't care. "It seems you found something interesting, George." The familiar voice of Lord Belton, his longtime friend, sounded beside him. "Something interesting?" George replied with an enigmatic smile. "Oh, don't play coy." Belton sipped his wine. "The young Miss Harcourt. She's charming, I'll admit. But don't you think you're taking a risk?" George cast him a sharp look. "Isabel isn't a risk. Not for you, perhaps." Belton shrugged. "But for her, you know how ruthless society can be. A young woman like her will never be seen as your equal." George's grip on his glass tightened, though his expression remained controlled. "Then maybe it's time to change that view." Meanwhile, Isabel was dragged from conversation to conversation by her aunt, but her mind remained elsewhere, caught in George's words. No matter how she tried to rationalize it, something about him felt real, a kind of authenticity she hadn't expected from someone of his station. But there was also fear. She knew the divide between them wasn't just about wealth or titles. His world was one of rules, intrigue, and expectations. Hers was simple and honest, but also fragile. When the night finally drew to a close, Isabel felt exhausted. Stepping out into the courtyard, the cool breeze caressed her face. She needed time to think. "Running away again, milady?" The familiar voice made her heart skip a beat. She turned to find George standing there, partly shadowed by a nearby tree. "It's not running away if no one is chasing me." "Is that so?" He stepped closer, a playful smile tugging at his lips. "Then why does it feel like you're running from me?" She crossed her arms, her tone defiant. "Maybe because I don't like men who complicate my life." He laughed softly, but there was a seriousness in his gaze. "I don't want to complicate your life, Isabel. I just want to be part of it." For a moment, all she could do was stare at him. He seemed sincere, but she wasn't sure if trusting him was wise. Before she could respond, they were interrupted. "Your Grace, an urgent message has arrived." George turned, his expression shifting instantly at the messenger's words. He nodded before looking back at Isabel. "It seems duty calls." She gave him a faint smile, though she couldn't explain the tightness in her chest as she watched him prepare to leave. "Then go." He held her gaze for a lingering moment before vanishing into the night. Isabel remained there, alone, with the unsettling feeling that somehow this story was only beginning. The morning light flooded the modest sitting room of the Harcourt home, highlighting the worn upholstery and the pile of bills Lady Matilda was unsuccessfully trying to conceal. Isabel sat at the table, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of cold tea as her mind wandered. George, or rather the Duke of Halford, had been occupying her thoughts relentlessly. "You seem so thoughtful, my dear," Matilda remarked, setting an empty teapot on the table. "I hope you're reflecting on the future that lies in your hands." "Aunt, please," Isabel sighed, her patience worn thin by Matilda's constant suggestions about marriage and social advantages. Matilda sat down, smoothing her skirts with a serious expression. "No, Isabel, listen to me. I know you're young and stubborn, but you must understand what's at stake here. This isn't just about you, it's about all of us." Isabel pressed her lips together. She knew Matilda wasn't entirely wrong. The family's survival hinged on seizing any opportunity for stability. Yet the thought of stepping into George's world felt overwhelming. That same morning, in the heart of London, George was at his grand estate, surrounded by servants and advisors, but his mind was elsewhere. "Your Grace, regarding the property in Yorkshire," began the butler, only to be interrupted by George's raised hand. "That can wait, Fitzwilliam," he said with a sigh, running a hand through his neatly combed brown hair. "There are other matters I need to address first." The butler raised his eyebrows, but wisely refrained from questioning further. George couldn't focus on his responsibilities. Ever since the ball, something inside him had been restless. He wondered how Isabel was, whether she still thought of him as a genuine man or merely another untouchable figure in the aristocratic world. "You look troubled, Alex." The casual voice of his friend, Lord Belton, echoed through the room as he entered unannounced, as was his habit. "Belton?" George sighed again. "Ah, so it's true? The great Duke has been ensnared by a lady," Belton teased, pouring himself a glass of wine. "Who would have thought?" "It's not that simple," George murmured, but the sharp look from his friend challenged him. "Then make it simple. If you care for her, do something about it." Meanwhile, Isabel was mustering the courage to face her aunt. "Aunt Matilda, I know you believe that a marriage to George would solve all our problems." "Because it would," Matilda interrupted firmly. "But he's not just a man. He's a duke. And we're... Matilda frowned, her niece's vulnerable tone catching her off guard. We're honest, hard-working people trying to survive. Do you think that matters to him? Isabel asked. Do you think he would bother with our circumstances if he didn't care for you? Matilda countered, surprising Isabel. Men like him don't waste time on frivolities. Isabel hesitated. As much as she resisted admitting it, part of her knew Matilda was right. George did seem sincere, but the weight of their social divide terrified her. Determined to prove his intentions, George decided to visit Isabel in person, with a plan in mind. Arriving at the Harcourts' modest home, he was greeted by Matilda, who looked as though she might faint at the sight of him. Your Grace, what an honor, she stammered, hastily fluffing the worn cushions on the sofa. I've come to speak with Isabel, George said politely but firmly. Matilda shot Isabel, who had just entered the room, a significant look. I'll be in the kitchen, Matilda said, giving a conspiratorial smile before leaving. Isabel stood frozen for a moment, staring at George with a mix of surprise and nervousness. Why are you here? She asked, crossing her arms. Because I want you to know my intentions are sincere, he began, stepping closer. I'm not perfect, Isabel. I know my title and position are a barrier, but I also know I've never felt this way before. She gazed at him, her eyes shining with emotion, but her voice was cautious. George, your life is one I don't understand. A world I don't belong to. How can I believe that this... She gestured between them. Could work? He held her gaze, his voice low but full of conviction. Because I believe in us, Isabel. I believe in you, and I'm ready to face any obstacle to be by your side. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but challenging. Then prove it. The days following George's visit were a whirlwind for Isabel. He had promised to prove his intentions, but she had no idea what that truly meant. Matilda's words echoed in her mind constantly. This is your chance to change the family's fate. Yet the fear that it was all an illusion lingered in her heart. That morning, Isabel went for a walk. The streets of London bustled as always, but to her, the world felt suspended. Passing through the central square, her eyes caught the display window of a modest bookstore, one of her favorite refuges, a place where she could escape reality. She stepped inside and began browsing, the familiar scent of aged pages soothing her restless mind. Absorbed in a volume of poetry, she suddenly heard George's unmistakable voice behind her. Wordsworth's poems? I wouldn't have guessed you enjoyed something so melancholic. She turned sharply, surprised to see him there. He was dressed discreetly, but his effortless elegance made it impossible not to notice him. What are you doing here? She asked, trying to sound composed, though her heart was racing. Looking for you. His smile was gentle, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her breath catch. She placed the book back on the shelf and crossed her arms. Looking for me? Why? He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Because I want to show you something. Come with me. And if I don't want to? Then I'll wait here until you change your mind, he replied with a playful tone, though his gaze remained serious. Isabel hesitated, but eventually nodded. He led her outside to a carriage waiting at the curb. Without revealing more, he guided her to the heart of London. When they arrived, Isabel stepped out and found herself in front of a small but charming building with a wooden facade and white-painted windows. What is this? She asked, puzzled. George opened the door and gestured for her to step inside. See for yourself. The interior was empty, save for a few simple furnishings. But what caught her attention were the walls, adorned with drawings she instantly recognized. These are my sketches, she said in disbelief, turning to face him. George smiled. You mentioned them once at the tea room? You said you dreamed of having a space to showcase your work. I thought this might be a start." Her eyes filled with tears. "You bought this for me?" "I bought it because I believe in you, Isabel," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want you to think what I feel for you is superficial. This," he gestured to the space around them, "is what I want to build with you. Not a title, not an obligation, but something real." She stood in silence for a moment, taking it all in. Part of her wanted to believe him, to accept his gesture and cast her doubts aside. But another part, the one that had always feared being used or hurt, still hesitated. "Why are you doing this, George?" she finally asked. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I see who you are. I see your strength, your courage, your passion. And I want to stand beside you, Isabel. Not as a duke and a lady, but as equals." "But we're not equals," she murmured, shaking her head. "Maybe not in the world's eyes," he said, gently taking her hand. "But that doesn't mean we can't be in our own." The gesture was simple, yet filled with meaning. Isabel felt a surge of emotion wash over her. For the first time, she realized George wasn't just offering wealth or security. He was offering something rarer: trust, respect, and the chance to build something together. "You know this won't be easy, don't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I do," he replied without hesitation. "But I'm ready to face whatever it takes." She looked at him, feeling her heart finally relent. "Then I suppose I'm willing to try as well." George smiled, a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "Then let's start here, Isabel." She glanced around the little gallery, and for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. The weeks that followed George's visit were a whirlwind for Isabel. The gallery he had purchased for her wasn't just a gesture, it was a real opportunity to showcase her talent. Gradually, she began working on the space, cleaning, organizing, and preparing her drawings for display. It was something she had never imagined possible. Yet doubts lingered. Despite George's support and sincerity, she couldn't help but question if their worlds could truly intersect without destroying them both. As Isabel poured herself into her art, rumors about her relationship with George began to swirl. And, as with any scandal in high society, they grew quickly, becoming the primary topic of conversation in London's tea rooms and dinner parties. It was no surprise, then, when Isabel received an invitation to the grand ball hosted by the Countess of Waverley. "You must go," Matilda said, clutching the invitation as though it were a winning lottery ticket. "Aunt, you know I don't belong in that world." "You do now, dear." Matilda gave her a stern look. "If George is willing to face the stares and judgment, so must you." The Countess of Waverley's ballroom was a masterpiece of opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the guests, dressed in their finest attire, moved like living works of art. Isabel entered, feeling like an imposter, but her resolve did not waver. She knew George would be there. He always kept his word, and that comforted her. "Lady Isabel, isn't it?" A stranger's voice interrupted her thoughts. Isabel turned to see a woman elegantly dressed, her smile anything but friendly. "Yes, that's me. My name is Lady Beatrice." The woman inclined her head. "You're the young lady who is, how shall I put it, associated with the Duke of Halford." Isabel flushed, but stood her ground. "If you mean to ask whether I'm his friend, yes, I am." Beatrice let out a soft, cutting laugh. "Oh dear, don't be naive. Do you really think he's serious? Men like him don't commit to—" She paused, her eyes gleaming with malice as she chose her words carefully. "Young women without position." Before Isabel could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Lady Beatrice, I see you're sharing your opinions again." Isabel turned to find George standing behind her, his gaze fixed firmly on Beatrice. There was a warning in his tone that made the other woman shrink back slightly. "Your Grace, I was merely—" "I believe your company is required on the other side of the ballroom," he said, his smile polite but icy. Beatrice curtsied quickly and excused herself, leaving Isabel and George alone. "I'm sorry for that," he said, turning to her. "Lady Beatrice has a particular talent for being unpleasant." "It's fine," Isabel replied, though she couldn't entirely hide how much the woman's words had stung. "No, it isn't," he said softly, leaning closer. "But I'm here now." They danced. The music filled the grand room, but for Isabel, everything around her seemed to fade away. George guided her with confidence, his presence making her feel safe despite the countless eyes she knew were watching them. "You know what they're saying, don't you?" she asked, breaking the silence. "I do," he replied without hesitation. "And it doesn't bother you?" He stopped, holding her firmly but gently. "Isabel, I want you to listen carefully." His voice was low but resolute. "I've spent my entire life being judged by my title, my choices, everything I do. But I will never, never let that interfere with what I feel for you." She blinked, startled by the intensity of his words. "And what is it you feel?" He smiled faintly, stepping closer. "That you are the best choice I've ever made." Before she could respond, the sharp sound of a cane striking the floor echoed through the ballroom. All eyes turned to the entrance, where the Earl of Halford, George's father, had arrived. He was an imposing man, his piercing gaze capable of cutting through anyone's defenses. "George." The Earl's voice was firm, and the room fell silent. George exhaled slowly and stepped back from Isabel. "Father." The Earl's eyes flicked to Isabel, then back to his son. "We need to talk, now." The tension in the room was palpable as George followed his father into an adjoining room. Isabel remained where she was, feeling exposed under the curious stares of the other guests. On the other side of the door, George faced his father's sharp gaze. "What exactly are you doing, George?" the Earl demanded, his tone more disappointed than angry. "I'm choosing my own happiness," George replied evenly. "Happiness?" The Earl let out a bitter laugh. "You know full well that men like us don't have the luxury of pursuing happiness." George crossed his arms, his stance unyielding. "Maybe it's time that changed." The Earl narrowed his eyes. "And you're willing to face the consequences of that?" George didn't hesitate. "I am." Epilogue. The choice of the heart months had passed since the confrontation at the ball, and Isabel's world seemed utterly transformed. The small gallery George had given her was no longer just a gift. It had become a thriving space, drawing local artists and curious visitors alike. Her hands were always busy, organizing exhibitions, curating pieces, and helping others find their artistic voices. Yet, despite all the progress, Isabel couldn't ignore George's absence. Since the ball, he had distanced himself, caught up in tense negotiations with his father and the unrelenting responsibilities of his dukedom. While his letters arrived regularly, the gap between their lives felt wider than ever. Isabel feared that everything was falling apart, not from a lack of love, but from forces beyond their control. "You're sighing again," Matilda remarked, sipping her tea from an armchair nearby. "I am not," Isabel replied, though her tone betrayed her. "He'll come back, dear. Men like him don't make promises lightly." Isabel wanted to believe her aunt's words, but the fear remained. That afternoon, as Isabel was locking up the gallery, a messenger appeared at the door. The envelope he carried was plain, with no crests or flourishes, but she immediately recognized the handwriting. "Meet me in the clearing north of town. Today at sunset. George." Her heart raced. Without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and left. The clearing was a spot they had visited once before, during a quiet escape from the chaos of London. When she arrived, the sun was low on the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and orange. There he was, George, dressed simply but exuding the same commanding presence as always. "You came," he said, a soft smile lighting up his face. Of course I did. Isabel tried to sound confident, though her nerves were palpable. What's going on? He took a few steps closer, his hands clasped behind his back. Isabel, I've spent these months trying to reconcile two parts of my life I never thought could coexist. My title and you. She bit her lip, staying silent. My father was clear in his opposition, he continued, his voice steady. He believes my duty is to the lineage, to the dukedom, and that anything outside that path is a weakness. Her heart tightened in her chest. And what do you believe? He met her gaze, his eyes glowing in the soft light of the setting sun. I believe you are the bravest choice I've ever made. Before she could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring. It was simple yet stunningly beautiful. Isabel Harcourt, I can't promise that our life will be easy. There will be judgments, challenges, and expectations. But I can promise that through it all you will have my heart. Forever. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't bother to hide them. George? Her voice cracked with emotion, unable to finish the sentence. You're the only one who's ever made me feel like I'm more than a title, Isabel, he said softly. I want us to be together, not out of obligation, but by choice, out of love. She looked at him, and in his eyes she saw something she never expected, vulnerability. Yes, she finally said, her voice trembling. Yes? The surprise and relief in his expression were almost comical. She laughed lightly, wiping her tears. Yes, George, I want to be by your side no matter the consequences. He slid the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a tight embrace. The weight of months of uncertainty and fear vanished in that moment. We'll face the world together, Isabel. She smiled against his chest. As long as you're with me, I believe we can face anything. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, far from the prying eyes and intrigues of high society. Yet news of their union spread quickly, and the scandal many had anticipated never materialized. Instead, their marriage became a symbol of change, of a love that transcended titles and traditions. Over time, Isabel's gallery flourished, becoming a hub for artists and dreamers from all walks of life. George, in turn, embraced his role as Duke with a renewed sense of purpose, balancing his responsibilities with the love he shared with Isabel. One quiet afternoon, as they strolled hand in hand through the countryside, Isabel glanced at George and said with a playful smile, You know, George, I think sitting at the wrong table was the best thing that ever happened to me. He chuckled, squeezing her hand tightly. It was the best thing that ever happened to both of us. As the sun dipped below the horizon, their laughter echoed across the fields, a reminder that the hardest choices, when made with the heart, can lead to the most extraordinary endings.